Welcome to How to Fix It. I'm John Avlon. And the purpose of this podcast is to focus on finding solutions to the problems we face, not just endlessly fixating on the problems. And we have seen crime deployed as a political weapon by the Trump administration, but also a lot of objectively bad ideas deployed on the far left that seem to be making a resurgence. So joining us this week to dig into the actual data, to look at what works and what doesn't, is John Miller. He ran counterterrorism in the NYPD for many years. He's a CNN senior analyst, and he has incredible claim to being one of the world's most interesting humans. He began as a journalist, and I think he is the only person I'm aware of, maybe with the exception of Peter Bergen, who interviewed Osama bin Laden a long time ago. So, John Miller, it's great to have you on How to Fix It.
Well, thanks, John, for bringing me in.
Listen, I want to start I want to give people some stats and facts, because Donald Trump has consistently hit this note from his first inauguration that America is living in an American carnage, that our streets are burning. And he's using it now as a pretext to deploy the National Guard in American cities against the governor's or mayor's will. Take a step back. Where are we, in fact, with crime trends in the United States today?
Well, violent crime has been trending down in the United States. The goal, if you want to set a marker or a milestone, would be, can we get back to where we were before pandemic? And pandemic is the marker, but there were a couple of influences there. One were sweeping criminal justice reform laws that made it harder to arrest, harder to prosecute, harder to jail or imprison criminals. The other were the sweeping George Floyd protests, which took a lot of governments and, frankly, police agencies and, more frankly, police officers to take a step back and say, am I really doing what my community wants me to be doing? But what we're seeing now is a readjustment. So, with shootings and murders trending down, with other crimes trending down, in cities that have been challenged, cities like Chicago, trending down, Milwaukee, trending down, Baltimore, faces enormous challenges. But New York City, the lowest homicide and shootings in recorded history in the modern CompStat era, where you could really rely on those figures exactly. So, there's two kind of places where you hear about with ever increasing crime. John, one of them is the people who sell, car alarms and home alarms and security services. And they say with ever increasing crime, no matter what crime is doing, because they can't say as crime is going down, we really think you should buy this. And then politicians who have an agenda. And we're seeing that.
Now, crime, I think in New York City's case, homicides peaked in the early 1990s, coincident with the crack epidemic. We were averaging over 2,000 murders a year. And then things changed dramatically in the mid-90s when Bill Bratton was police commissioner, Rudy Giuliani was mayor. And they began really a revolution in policing. There was CompStat, computerized statistics, giving more detailed, accurate, up-to-date information. But there was also a philosophy of quality of life crimes, right? That is sometimes known as broken windows theory, from an article written by George Kelling in The Atlantic in the early 1980s. And basically, broken windows theory says if there's excessive civic disorder, it creates a permission structure for there to be more low-level crime. And that has a way of spiraling. Now, a lot of folks pushed back on broken windows theory around the time we saw a crime spike, saying it was de facto racist, that the cuts in crime that had objectively occurred were coincident to that strategy, not as a result of it. What's your take on broken windows theory and whether it works?
Well, we know it works because we watched it work. Now, this is nuanced, and it's really important to understand this because broken windows has gotten a bad name. The problem is it's not a bad system. So let's take it apart. The article in The Atlantic by George Kelling and James Q. Wilson,
yes,
took this position that if you let disorder increase, as you brilliantly framed it, you give a permission structure for it to increase into things that are beyond disorder, into violence, into crime, and slowly your control of order slips away. That it is a contagion in some ways, a cancer that grows. that was translated by many people who probably only read, half the article to say, look, if there's a broken window and you don't fix it right away, then you'll pass that abandoned building and all the windows will be broken. If there's a piece of graffiti and it's left there, the whole thing will be covered. If people are urinating in the street and smoking weed on the corner and nobody gets a summons or an arrest or anything for that, then that'll just become common practice. Okay, so it all makes sense. And then they said, if you address these things, that it won't spiral into violent crime. This is where we part company. Let me move my head for a second. See that guy right there?
That's
Jack Maple.
Jack Maple, yeah.
Jack Maple was Bill Bratton's brilliant crime strategist. And what he did was, he took the broken windows theory, which became a bumper sticker, which is, if you focus on the little things, the big things will take care of themselves. Okay, that's a myth. What Jack said is, I don't know what these guys were thinking, but here it is. If you focus on the little things, that will help maintain some semblance of order and a consciousness of order. But if you don't focus on the big things and target the violent predators who are out there, who are doing the robberies, who are doing the assaults, who are doing the rapes, who are, running the drug organizations that kill people who cross over because of turf, then broken windows isn't going to help you. The way you can use broken windows, and this is what Jack taught us, was, all right, we're targeting the violent predators, not the graffiti and the beer drinking on the corner and all that, because that's job one. But we will use broken windows by saying, look, we're trying to reduce robberies in the subway. This was Jack's big breakthrough. So we're going to focus on people jumping over the turnstiles without paying. And I remember sitting in the back of the lanes with Jack smoking a cigar saying, why are you focusing on people who were taking, 35 cents back then from the transit authority when you should be following these guys who are doing the robberies? And he said, Johnny, do you think the robbers pay to get on the subway? No. And what they found is, by focusing enforcement on two things, they put out decoys who look like robbable victims who were either overserved or unconscious or sleeping, wearing jewelry and things like that. That got a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of predators. But they also started this very big enforcement about people not paying fare evasion, jumping the turnstiles. And what did they find? That a good percentage of them were carrying a weapon when they were stopped coming into the system. What were they going to use that weapon for on the subway? That a good percentage of them were already wanted for violent crimes and had warrants out. And where had those crimes been committed? A good percentage of them were committed in the subway system. So now you're stopping people because of a broken windows theory of, we're going to do some minor enforcement, but we're kind of writing a ticket for the dolphins. Okay, don't do that again. But we're getting the sharks as they're coming in to swim in the system. So this is kind of the misunderstood part of it. People who don't like broken windows want to paint it as, and write this down, zero tolerance, right? If you see any disorder, you write that up. That's not how we did it in the NYPD. What we did is we let the community set the tolerance. What is it that's driving you crazy? What are we hearing at the community meetings at the precinct? What are people calling 911 about? And we reflected their tolerance in our enforcement. But that's how we went from 2,245 murders, 100,000 robberies, 5,000 shootings, to under 1,000 murders in a city of 8.6 million for multiple years.
Much lower.
Under 1,000 shootings in the 800s. Cities, a tiny percentage of our size had more shootings than that. 20,000 robberies. We changed literally by behavior modification, by setting what would be tolerated and what wouldn't, but not zero tolerance. We changed the way people lived in New York City. People could walk around at night, cross Central Park after dark. I mean, it was remarkable.
There was pushbacks early on, and some of them, I think, were credible. I think George Kelling, I believe, before he passed away, clarified that the policy known as stop and frisk was not necessary for broken windows theory.
And stop and frisk is a clear example, John, of what happens when you overwind your toys. Okay, Crime was low and it was going lower. And, the police department, and this is after Commissioner Bratton left and Jack Maple had passed away. And they decided, look, crime is so low, but we think we can get it lower. We've got this big budget. We've got all these cops, but how do we make it go lower? And the idea was, well, more police activity means less crime. So let's stop more people, give more summonses, do more, physical searches. And it became a statistic as opposed to a strategy. Because at the ComStat meetings, where they were normally talking about, what are you doing about these robberies? What are you doing about these thefts? They were like, you have a little crime over here that's poking up. How many stops have you been doing? And that translated to a precinct commander saying, they're asking me how many stops I'm doing because I'm having a problem over here that may have nothing to do with stops. So they'd go to the lieutenant and they'd say, tell the sergeants we need them to get the cops to do more stops. And the sergeant would say, everybody here, you need 7 stops, okay? So that means any good cop worth his salt in a high crime area could figure out 2 people who could raise reasonable suspicion to do a stop on. But that takes care of 2 or 3. And, when you have to come back with 7, you're not gonna just say, well, we missed the mark today. You're going to go stop 3 or 4 people who don't need stopping. And that's where you lose the community. And by the way, let me tell you the dirty little secret. We reduced stop and frisk when Bill Bratton came back into the police department by 85 and then 90%. And guess who got more guns with their strategy? Stop and frisk, or what we did, which is to use the intelligence bureau's field intelligence officers to question everybody who was arrested about, hey, who do you know who has an illegal gun? Where is that gun? When did you last see that gun? Do they have that gun on them? Is that gun connected to any crimes? Now, instead of stopping people because I saw the guy, I thought I saw a bulge under his hoodie, he looked dirty to me, so we stopped him. Pretty amorphous. Now you've got a trained investigator who's operating with actionable intelligence from a named individual that has been written down and recorded in a document that's been brought to the district attorney and has caused them to write a search warrant that's been signed by a judge and will be executed under those terms. Now you have a process that's not laden with, well, he looked dirty to me. Now you've got a process that's laden with legal process and not just reasonable suspicion, but probable cause. And that is how we ended up taking tens of thousands of guns off the street without stopping anybody that we didn't have a good reason to stop.
And that's just a reminder that, sometimes being more precise is also being more effective. And you can measure the wrong things. Now, we had a long decline in crime, and then we saw an uptick. And as you say, COVID is a major factor. There's, kicking folks out of mental institutions who'd previously been housed there. You saw, certainly in the New York City region, an increase in a decrease in quality of life and an increase in sort of quality of life crimes. At the same time, you had the George Floyd era disastrous slogan, defund the police, that the vast majority of folks don't actually believe, but some did, one of whom is the, by polling, leading candidate to be the next mayor of New York, and bail reform. Well-intentioned, but didn't have its intended impact and, in fact, spurred a backlash. So break those things out. When we had these gains that were taken for granted, there was some significant backsliding. What led to it? And then I want to talk about what's changed more recently in the city of New York.
Well, it's really interesting because what led to it essentially were, those 3 sweeping factors, which is crime went down during COVID because nobody was on the street. Certain things spiked, like car theft, because car thieves realized, hey, nobody's moving these cars, driving these cars, or is he even going to know that they're gone for a long time? But then crime rebounded because, you saw a sense of lawlessness, particularly involving violent crime and gun crime, as COVID ebbed. Factor 1, COVID. But before COVID, the New York State legislature decided, and, Zoran Mondani would have been one of those legislators, presumably, to vote in a Criminal Justice Reform Act that was a solution in search of a problem. I mean, crime was already low. We had reduced the population on Rikers Island from something like 15 or 20,000 to, 5 or 7,000. And violent predators who needed to be held on bail were being held on bail. And there was an argument, and factually correct, that there was a racial disparity in the people
Yes.
who were being held in Rikers Island versus people who were making bail. But there was another fact, an uncomfortable fact, which was, if it's a racist criminal justice system, it's a racist system of crime, because the largest number of victims of violent crime were people of color, the largest number of homicide victims. The calls of 911 of violent crime came from neighborhoods that suffered from economic deprivation, which is a driver of crime. But they were also, the law-abiding people who expected the police to come to solve that case, to make that arrest, to put that person away. The very same things, the same reasonable expectations that people have on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, or downtown, or on the West Side, and it was a conundrum, because political people weren't breaking down, well, who are the perpetrators? Okay, we see largely people that indicate this is a racially imbalanced system. Well, when you said, well, okay, who are the victims that called the police and expected that service? It was the same thing. They left that part out. They pushed this bill through. One guy who's running for mayor voted for it, and another guy who's running for mayor signed it as governor.
I don't know if Mamdani was in the assembly at that time, but certainly when he was running, he did say that. I mean, that he said cops were actually a leading cause of crime. But I just want to clarify that.
Well, thank you for that correction. And he has made a number of statements since then, which he has adjusted to much more nuanced and reasonable positions. And one has to ask, how much of that is kind of the maturing of intent and the grasp of reality, and how much of that is just politics.
Yep.
But the result was we went to everybody. The New York City Police Department did. Commissioner O'Neill did. We traveled to Albany. Mayor de Blasio came with us. Eric Adams did it again with Commissioner Sewell. We met with all the legislators and said, if you do this, crime will go up. More victims will become victims. And, they will be in some of the very same places you are claiming this is going to add additional protection for, in terms of other things. And the leadership of the Assembly and the Senate, were very clear in their statements, which is, we've heard this before, we get what you think, but, we're doing this and we're doing it now. And predictably, crime went up, murder went up, shootings went up. And it took a long time for the NYPD to adjust strategies. It took Governor Hochul kind of going back into that legislation and making changes, minor ones at first, more significant ones later. But the perfect storm of saying, we expect everybody to be released without having to pay bail, even if they have a long record that shows that they are going to commit this crime again and again and again, because that's what their history shows. The New York State is the only state in the United States where dangerousness is not a factor that a judge can consider.
That is, I just want to put a pin in that, because New York City led a lot of the national crime decline through adjustments and strategies, but we are the only state in the nation where judges cannot take into account the dangerousness of an individual. And why is that?
Because it was decided when they constructed these laws that bail should be the thing that ensures your return to court, and that the presumption of innocence should trump the idea of dangerousness, because you aren't here for your history. You're here for this case, which you're presumed innocent of, and we want to see what is your likelihood of returning to court. Now, to be honest, basically what the system did to account for that is judges would look at the person's record. They would say this person is a violent predator, has been for some time, is very likely to reoffend, and I'm going to set bail at a certain number. And if they put up that money, they'll get out. And if they don't, they'll be where they can't hurt anybody. They kind of did that by taking into account other judgments, but I think they did it more in cases where dangerousness was a factor. After bail reform came out, they had relieved the judges of this discretion. They said, for these kinds of crimes, you can set bail. For these kinds of crimes, you can't. And they said to district attorneys, for these kinds of crimes, you can ask for bail. And for these kind of crimes, you can't. And they said, for these kinds of crimes to cops, you can make an arrest. But now you can't anymore. You can just write a ticket. So we entered this bizarre world coming out of COVID where you could walk into Duane Reade, take your arm and sweep everything off the shelf into a bag and walk out with 20 bottles of $7.70 shampoo. And then you could see a car running in front, a brand new Lexus, and you could get into that car that cost $77,000 and steal it. And the penalty for the shampoo and the Lexus was the same, which is, well, that's a nonviolent crime. And, we're going to write you a ticket for stealing from the Duane Reade, and we're going to write you a desk appearance ticket for stealing this car, and we'll see you in court. And, the DAT, desk appearance ticket, became known as the disappearance ticket because a lot of those people didn't show up for court because they realized, you know what? The system is built for me not to have to worry about ending up in a jail cell or Rikers Island or anything. It's working in my favor now. And the odds of my getting caught every time are low. So I'm just going to keep doing this. They created a system that actually manufactured more recidivists.
Right. And it gave the impression that things were lawless, right? Because the laws were not being enforced. I think one of the unsung slogans out of this mayoral election is make crime illegal again, because there was a sense for a while it wasn't. You created a perverse incentive structure that made law-abiding citizens feel like the system wasn't working. And that, of course, plays into someone like Donald Trump's hands. It should be said, though, that over the last year and change with Jessica Tisch as the new police commissioner and Randy Mastro as deputy mayor, there's been a renewed emphasis not only on criminal justice reforms that Kathy Hochul pushed through to sort of strengthen the bail reform laws, but also a refocus on quality of life crimes that seems to have worked. Is that an accurate perception and characterization rooted in policy?
So that is. And I mean, looking back on that whole experiment, life is long, maybe the experiment was worthy to see, well, what if it does fix the racial imbalance in the criminal justice system? Which it didn't. It just altered the number of people who were victims of crimes who didn't see justice because they saw the same person who committed the crime against them on the street the same day because they didn't get arrested and didn't go to jail. So, I mean, I think the adjustments were important, but Jessica Tisch, under Mayor Adams, put this real focus on, we've got to focus on the subways, which was one of the mayor's priorities, and we have to focus back on the streets, which is, if we're giving summonses for these kinds of things that are driving people crazy, this is what people complain about in the neighborhoods. We've got to bring that back. And frankly, if those people are involved in other crimes, which is kind of the melding of James Q. Wilson, George Kelly, and Jack Maple's theories, by being able to stop those people and issue that summons and get their ID and run them for warrants, we are now being put in a position again where we can take people off the street who have done more serious things because we are encountering them on a lower level disorder. So as Bill Bratton likes to say, what's old is new again. We've come full circle, but we've also completed the experiment for the third time to see, does this actually work? And the answer is, yeah, it works.
All right. So that should definitively answer the question, does broken windows theory work? Does quality of life policing work? It should clear up some of the confusion.
It does, but only if applied correctly.
Well, yes, and that's really important. Stop and frisk, not an essential component to broken windows theory. And that's really important because people's civil rights and civil liberties were being abused, but that is not essential to the effective deployment of this policing strategy, which again is just proven.
It was bad for everybody, John. I mean,
I think ultimately
it was bad
absolutely
for people because you're three kids with your backpacks on coming back from school. And there's cops, who are out there on that foot post who have been told we have to stop a number of people, and they're stopping you. And, when you get home and you say, I got stopped by the police, and your mother's saying, what did you do? I didn't do anything. And this is the third time this week. It wasn't good for the cops either, because they're like, why am I stopping these guys? I got to make this
wrong.
Number.
Right? It polarized policing, and that's the worst thing you can do. And it distracted from the fact that if you looked at polling when initially defund the police was put forward, the communities that were least in favor of it were often communities of color, right? This is about, refund the police, reform the police where it's necessary. But the idea of defunding this hostility, it should be totally discredited. It's certainly a political loser. It's a practical loser. And so you say we just engaged in
tin ear for politicians too, because,
for sure.
I never went to a community meeting in a police precinct where they came in and said, you know what we need? Fewer cops.
Right.
Never heard that.
That never happens. And yet, the idea that this is settled doesn't seem to track with reality because the Democratic nominee for mayor and the person considered to be the clear favorite, Assemblyman named Zoran Mamdani, tweeted in 2020 that the New York City Police Department was racist, anti-queer, and a major threat to public safety. The police are a major threat to public safety. Now, that was 5 years ago. Now, I should say he was a fully formed adult when he did that. And that presumably represents a major, something he believed. He has distanced himself from it. And as mayor, you can't always follow every ideological impulse, but it matters also within the culture of whether the cops feel like the mayor's got their back. And the DSA generally, the Democratic Socialists of America, do tend to historically have a more hostile view of the police and are the leading critics of quality of life policing and broken windows theory. They want to dismantle it. They want to pull it back. So do you really think that we've had the experiment and this is a settled issue? And what do you think happens if they come in and we rerun the experiment again?
Well, that's a really interesting question, particularly as it applies to Mamdani. And I say that because, when Bill de Blasio was elected as a progressive mayor who people accused of being a socialist, his theory was, if I lose crime, I'm going to lose my entire progressive agenda. I'm not going to be able to accomplish anything if suddenly disorder comes back the way it did before the mayors before me. So he brought in Bill Bratton and he said, your job is to take care of crime and disorder. My job is to move forward with a larger agenda. So he could get school lunches in pre-K and all those things. Zoran Mamdani has adjusted his rhetoric about police and policing. He's saying, well, I would consider keeping Commissioner Tisch. I think that the police department, they have 32,000 cops. I don't think we should defund them. I think we should leave it at 32,000. So he's singing from a different sheet of music. My question is he taking a page from Mayor de Blasio's book, which is, I've got to maintain crime and order, even though that may not play well as a slogan from my base. It's pretty much, what most voters want. Mm-hmm. Or is he just saying things, to try to widen, his acceptability? There's only one way to find that out.
Yeah, but I would just say that, the idea of a law and order progressive should not be a contradiction. Democrats in particular need to make sure that they have low crime, because if they don't, they play right into the far right's hands, right? This is true time immemorial. If there is too much, the founding fathers warned, anarchy is the fastest path to tyranny, right? And so when you allow lawlessness and disorder to rise, people start to look for in a more authoritarian direction, which brings us to Donald Trump. When you see the deployment of the National Guard against the will of governors and mayors, in an environment where there is not high crime by any historical standard. And I'm a tough on crime guy. You've worked your life in the police department. How dangerous do you think that dynamic is, the threat to deploy armed soldiers into the streets of American cities?
Well, it's being framed as we have to help quell this violence and bring order, but I mean it's largely performative. Number one, the National Guard cannot enforce the law or make arrests or act as police. Number two, the places where they're saying we have to get crime under control are having lower crime than they had before. Number three, there are states with Republican governors and cities with Republican mayors that have far worse crime problems where this is not being contemplated. So on one level, it is what it appears to be. On another level, you've been reading some of the opinion pieces coming out by people who are having increasing worry that this is more than that. Mm-hmm. I think Robert Reich had one the other day, another academic who polled a number of other professors from different well-known institutions came to the same conclusion, which is they are numbing, the American public to the idea that the Army shows up in their town and that they are there occupying it for a period of time and that they're there to do good and there's nothing to be afraid of and that there's some good reason for it. And when people become accustomed to that, then what happens when, during other times they say, well, okay, we're coming back. And then what happens, during the elections when they say, well, we're putting them at polling locations. And then what happens when they say, well, we think the election is rigged, but, we have our forces in town and we're going to, seize the ballot boxes. And, it's one of these rolling continuums, which is there a bigger picture behind this? Is this part of a larger strategy? And there is zero evidence to that regard. And I think it's important to point that out. But there's increasing worry to that regard. If you're reading the pieces of people who say this follows the study of governments that become increasingly authoritarian and autocratic, where the first thing is you create a crisis, then you solve it with more enforcement and more force and more forces. And then people become accustomed to that. And then you use that to push forward.
You think that's a danger?
I think that's a discussion now about where are we really going here, since the National Guard has no real application to crime in the way that they have perfectly logical applications to riot. The last time they invoked the Insurrection Act to deploy the National Guard into a city was the LA riots. 63 dead, $1 billion in damage to property, 2,000 injuries. And now you're comparing that to, you've got a loud group of protesters who come to the back of the ICE location in Portland, and, who are interfering with agents in the street in Chicago. Does that equal the call for the National Guard? Now, listen, there's a flip side.
Let me answer that question for you, Miller. No.
No, okay. There's a flip side to this discussion, right? I am the mayor of Chicago, and they say they're sending me the National Guard. There's the Memphis approach. They didn't ask for it. They didn't want it, but they're getting it. How would I put that to work? Instead of saying I'm going to have them deployed with ICE agents in the street in, camouflage uniforms with M16s, I would say, oh, okay, so I'm getting the National Guard and a bunch of federal agents. This is what I need. I need you to take more of my violent crime cases, particularly involving guns, into federal court. I need you to target my major gangs that are the source of the most shooting and gun violence in the street with federal charges and RICO counts, and I need you to fast track that. That's what I want out of the FBI, the ATF, and the U.S. Attorney, okay? That's my number one request. And how many of these guards people am I getting? Okay, so every time I have a shooting in Chicago, officers Avlon and Miller respond and we've got the shooting scene, but I need 2 cops to block that end of the street, 2 cops to block that end of the street, and I need 2 more cars for the perimeter. Now I'm a district commander and I've got 6 cars out on a shooting because I've got to control the crowd, maintain the crime scene. It's how about after 30 minutes, I get 6 teams of National Guard people to handle my perimeter for that. I put those cops back on patrol where people are waiting for police to respond to their calls. And now I've got some use of them. If I live in Chicago, where on Michigan Avenue, gangs of thugs will drive a car through a store window and loot a store for handbags or iPhones or whatever, are they really going to do that if they see a Humvee and 6 guardsmen, every couple of blocks? I don't think so. But if I'm getting them, I would want to work them.
Well, I think that's right. I think it's another indication, though, that if you're really concerned about crime, you would pass a major crime bill to better fund and get these mayors what they need. It's also a reminder that mayors and Democrats in general, I think, need to be much more on the ball of making sure that they have low crime and high quality of life so that it doesn't create a pretext. Not that they even would, need a pretext, but it doesn't even create a pretext because perceptions of civic disorder can be exploited in ways that I think are dangerous to our democracy. I want to ask you before we go, because you ran counterterrorism at the NYPD. I mentioned you did interview Osama bin Laden as a journalist before joining the NYPD. One of the dangers, it seems to me, and I spoke to Congressman Dan Goldman about this, is that the FBI is being run by sort of a partisan hack who doesn't seem to be able to run the department and have the respect of the agents, but seems very willing, as we now know, the Wall Street Journal reporting that the president ordering the AG to go after his political enemies. And with a lot of these appointments, it's sort of partisanship and personal loyalty first, not professional expertise. One iconic example is the former Heritage intern who previously had been working as a landscaper, clearly a very right-wing young guy in his early 20s, having a key role at Homeland Security. How concerned are you, in addition to the fact that a lot of our allies might not be sharing intelligence as freely as they once did, that we're setting ourselves up for a dangerous situation in terms of deterring terrorism?
Well, I'm particularly concerned for the FBI. And for the Department of Homeland Security, because, when it comes to their shifting priority, I want the FBI to be back in the business of fighting crime, is what Kash Patel says. And there's nothing wrong with that. The FBI can do enormous good with violent crime. But there are certain things that the FBI does that other agencies don't do and can't do. One is public corruption. And one of the first things that happened is they eliminated basically the entire public corruption squad out of the Washington field office.
Funny that, huh, Joe?
Interesting. I mean, if there's one place you would probably want to have a good public corruption squad with experienced investigators, it might be Washington, D.C.
Probably.
Another is, the advanced cyber capabilities of hostile foreign powers who want to use that to interfere with elections, to stir the pot in American society by magnifying things that are bad and trying to get into divisions between right and left and all kinds of people to make sure that we're at each other's throats all the time. That was, kind of the cyber, malign actors fusion cell. That was also eliminated. And, who picks that up? Nobody.
Nobody.
The Department of Homeland Security, their key infrastructure protection program, they announced an investigation into Chris Krebs, who said, we carefully monitored, the election and it was a clean election. And they said, well, for saying that, you're now under criminal investigation. But they also wiped out, most of that department too. So what I'm worried about, and push the politics aside, because once politics become a part of any of these discussions, whether it's the policing discussion, the broken windows discussion, gun control, active shooters, cyber crime, elections, all logic seeps out immediately. Let's just go for the practical realities of, well, now that you got rid of these things, if there is election interference, who's going to find it? If somebody claims there was election interference, who's going to be able to verify that? We've basically cast ourselves into blindness in areas of counterterrorism, where they've reduced critical numbers of people, FBI squads, where offices have hundreds of agents chasing migrants in the street instead of investigating their cases, cyber threats that are getting greater, not smaller, literally as we sit here. I'm worried that we are making ourselves weaker, not stronger, in terms of literally the intelligence. And intelligence is overcomplicated. It's simple. Intelligence is understanding a problem. Good analysis is understanding it well enough to do something about it. And having those action arms that can affect it is the key to finishing. Find it, fix it, finish. We've diminished a lot of those capabilities in favor of what? I don't know.
Well, we know that a lot of resources are being devoted to targeting a president's political enemies, which is the ultimate form of politicization. I assume the way to fix it is to go back to a nonpartisan approach to policing that is data-driven and evidence-based. Do you think we need another crime bill? I mean, do you think we need a lot of democratic norms to be written into law as opposed to understood?
Well, it's a complicated question because the answer is yes. That's not complicated. But it also involves states' rights, so you get to New York City where we have the lowest gun crime in recorded history. And then you get to Chicago where their gun crime is lower, but it's still double what New York's is at a city that's half the size, which means it's worse than double. Okay?
That's a problem, yeah.
But why is that? Well, because in New York, possessing a loaded firearm illegally is a felony. In Chicago, it's a misdemeanor. In New York, if you have a loaded gun, they're likely to prosecute you for that. And they're likely to do a full assessment on all your other criminal issues and background and put that in front of a judge to say, here's the total picture of this guy we picked up with this loaded gun who cannot have that for a good reason. In Chicago, prosecutor looks at that case and they said, well, he had a loaded gun, but if he wasn't using it in the commission of a robbery or some other violent crime, then it's just a gun. And, when everybody's carrying a gun, and where do the guns in Chicago come from? They come from 3 states, outside of Illinois. It's one of those things where lawmakers have to go back and say, how did we do this to ourselves? And how do we fix it? And in New York, that's been one of the struggles with this criminal justice reform law. One of the immediate effects of raise the age was that bad guys who were over 18 started giving their guns and other things and having people commit crime who were under the age after they raised it because they're like, wow, this kid is going to face, juvenile justice, not criminal justice. And it's to our advantage to have them in the gang. I don't think that had the desired effect.
Sure as hell didn't. John Miller, I want to thank you for your lifetime of service, your insights, and for joining us on How to Fix It.
Well, thank you very much. It's an interesting discussion, and it's great to bring some clarity of it, without the cloud of politics. It's just the facts, as they used to say on Dragnet.
Just the facts, ma'am. John Miller, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, John.